Hello everyone, I'm Zeenat Firdaus. I have Dr. Sukant Khurana with me. He is a well-known entrepreneur, mentor, scientist, public speaker, and an artist. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much.
So this series is about art and technology, and I would like to ask you that what is color theory?
Interesting question. See, in visual arts, color theory is a practical guidance to color mixing and the visual effects to specific color combination. Now, from technology point of view, it is quite interesting, but from the point of view of really how colors are perceived or how colors are built, it's not the most useful thing. And from AI point of view, again, it's not the most useful thing. It has its historic role and it still serves a utility. Let me explain why. Because our brain is not just perceiving pigments, even in simple wavelength forms. There are several interactions, not just at the level of thalamus or the visual cortex. I'll try to keep neuroscience light, but you can't blame me. I have a PhD in neuroscience, right? So I'll try to give you a simple perspective that even in your retina, various shapes, colors are being processed. There is a preference, and you can look at so many visual effects of black and white dots being seen as color. So color is for our brain is not objective. Color in the sense of color of wavelength of light is different than what you'll see even perceive on a canvas in form of either reflected light or absorbed light, right? And then so your perception obviously it has to be reflected to come to your eyes, but how it is there, right? So let's think of what gave rise, right? People were interested earlier, they couldn't understand brain, they were interested in how colors are represented, they were interested in having understanding for art, right? So people designed color wheel and geometrically separated them into primary colors, right? Basically, where the idea is that you can mix them and produce any combination. Then you have secondary colors, right, which is mixing of two primary colors. And then you have tertiary colors, which are intermediate color made by mixing full saturation of one primary color and half saturation of other things like that. So your primary, secondary, tertiary colors and the basic understanding. Understanding color theory goes back to antiquity. There are even works in India in classical Sanskrit literature. There are Persian works. The best documented where we have written records, a sort of history of historism and writing, which wasn't very well in South Asia and Middle East. Wasn't the case necessarily with Greeks and Romans. So you have um, much nuanced records by Aristotle and Claudius Ptolemy, right, where they discuss how colors can be produced by mixing other colors. Then, if you look at later around, from 800, 900 AD onwards, you have amazing cultural revolutions actually in Middle East with the rise of Islam. Now, Islam is not necessarily seen in the present day and age as a force for science, but Islam in its earlier days was actually a very interesting force. People expanded, conquered new territories. Not everything was peaceful, but they also learned new things and they dominated trade and hence learned new things from various regions, mixed them, created new knowledge. So if you look at Al-Kindi in 873 AD, you look at Ibn al-Haytham, right, 1039. Ibn Sina is, cultural tour de force. I mean, it's like Vinci of his time. You look at Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, right? All these people looked at how colors are formed, and then you have beginning of European thinkers, right? So you have Robert Grosseteste in 1253 AD, right? And then they started sort of bit more modern approaches to color theory, which are very interesting when you look at writings of Leon Battista Alberti, right, around 1430s, 1435, and no other than Leonardo da Vinci in 1490. But if you really look at formalization of color theory became in 18th century, especially after optics 1704 by Isaac Newton, right? and nature of primary colors. From there, it developed into independent artistic tradition with only superficial reference to colorimetry and vision science. And see, colorimetry is essentially about science and technology to quantify, describe physical human color perception. Right? It's similar to spectral photometry, but it's distinguished by the interest in reducing the spectra to the physical correlates of color perception, right? Wavelength, intensity, blackness, and whatnot. So we'll, or if you think of vision science, right, it's visual perception. Now, if you think of all of it in the more comprehensive sense of how brain perceives it, context matters. Even your mood can change your color perception, culture changes. So all these simplistic color theory is a good thing to start, but that should not be necessarily the end for an artist. And color theory still plays a role if you're printing something. Um, and it's somehow still taught to people how to mix colors. And I would say I'm glad I was a bad student. I never thought very highly of my art teachers. When I was in class fourth, art teacher was showing us some basic thing, and I was in a family which was highly patriotic. I'll discuss my own politics, why I no longer feel very strongly for India. I came back, tried to fight, you might even say in a rather revolutionary way for India. And then I gave up after suffering so many losses, including losing my mother, realizing all of Indian academia is so rotten. Despite having, I think, good leadership, even earlier, whether Manmohan Singh or Modi, they do want to see India stronger. But with the rotten academia India has, the scientific class of India is so corrupt, so sexually depraved, so nepotistic, I don't see hope, and I kind of gave up. But that's a different story. But when I grew up in a home, so when in class fourth, they asked us to make something, and I still have that painting I made, uh, very similar to how Bhagat Singh would look like in a photograph. The teacher couldn't believe, and she asked me to make one, and then in front of everyone else, I made better than what I had submitted. Right. So my art teachers were hated me. They gave me full marks. They really didn't want to see me in class, and I really never thought of anything. When one teacher told me, "You make rows like this," I said, "Idiots make rows like this because that's just copying. I'm trying to see what a rose can be, not what a rose is." That was my discussion in class 8. So for me, learning color theory, I'm not necessarily saying I've been that great. There are people who are possibly better artists than me, at least in the execution part, because I've been quite honestly pursuing my science, technology, interest in weapons, interest in neuroscience, interest in drug discovery, interest in music and writing far more than I always get to pursue art. But for me, the idea of color theory is to say, here are the rules, and they're only valid for some small aspect. But in reality, every media you pick up, you do hit and fall. But you know, from the way people teach it, colors can be recorded, classified warm and cold. They can be classified receding and advancing, positive, negative, subtractive, or and additive. Right? People sort of started with color abstractions, and some of these wrong ideas of color abstraction continue. Right? Colors were historically portrayed as contrast between yellow and blue. You see advertising agencies, they still talk about it. When they talk of color, a good description which is valid, you can still talk of value. Light or dark, black versus white, that's the value. Chroma is like the saturation, purity, strength, intensity, intense versus dull. And hue is you're talking of the color family, red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta. But look at it. One is the wavelength, and red is not like very narrow wavelength. We're not saying something hypothetically at, I'm not using the accurate numbers, I'm just 490 nanometer is the wavelength that defines red, which actually is not. I'm using a wrong hypothetical example. Or, but it might be a window from 400 to 500, right? What is perceived, and the perception in brain may change because end of the day, it's a wavelength, right? And when the wave goes through a certain media, let's say it's passing through water, there are certain changes. Speed of light is not constant. That gives rise to refraction, right? Okay. So whatever is being classified by artists with no physics knowledge or with no ideas of neuroscience, it's good practical guide for them. But in reality, even the best of the artists who may not come from a scientific background or technological background like me, they are still not using these guides. But there is a bit of historical thing, right? Color theory originally started with primary colors like red, yellow, blue, RYB, because they were believed that these were capable of mixing with all other colors, right? And this continued on, and this theory of colors in 1810 by Johann Wolfgang Goethe, von Goethe or Goethe, however you like to pronounce, and law of simultaneous color contrast by an almost equally accomplished French industrial chemist, in contrast to Goethe, who's known for several other things, theorist, aesthetician, architect, musician, right? But in contrast, you had a very accomplished French industrial chemist, Michael Eugene Chevreul. He had, again, the RGB popularized for the notions we still discuss now. Uh, but then there was Charles Hayter, right, who published in 1826 a very interesting thing, a new practical treatise on three primitive colors, right, and assumed as perfect system for rudimentary information. So he tried to construct all the colors from these three. So later on, excuse me. So later on, these colors were sort of anchored in the three cones of eyes. We'll discuss how even our understanding of still color perception in eye is still evolving. It's not final word yet. But by and large, we know quite a lot. Retina trichromacy, right? So chrome means color, trichromacy is the basic understanding of how eye works. And people sort of, there was increasingly more sophisticated models of color space, right? Okay. Basically organization of colors, color profiling in various physical, you know, devices and all. So there was ideas of color space, and there was this whole opponent process theory that human visual system interprets information about color by processing signals from cone cells and rod cells in an antagonistic manner. So, like, the idea is one set of cells are coding for intensity but not color, largely true. There are other ideas of how, not just ideas, proven facts of what other things add to perception. I'm not going to go into nuances of vision science here, but they sort of got expanded, right? But when it came time to industrial chemistry, photography, right? So when we had it to take it to feasible mass print media, right? All of it is all good, but now you get money in the middle. You have to print things out. When you have to print things out, all of this changed to cyan, magenta, and yellow instead of just the RGB, and the system became CMYK. Okay, so the whole idea is cyan, right? Magenta, yellow, and K is for key. Key means black, right? So this primary color scheme were seen as subtractive to RGB. And the reason was obviously the cost of printing. But it's not perfect because if you go with a CMYK in the printer, you're not putting 10,000 color cartridges, right? You might see when you think of color cartridges, you don't put RGB. Uh, Most of the color cartridges, there are exceptions, they come with CMYK, right? Okay, so you basically get cyan, magenta, yellow, and then you get black ink. So the CYMK started with the idea that it's the negative, sort of to say, subtractive is the right word for RGB, but this resulted in some colors not being printed perfectly. Orange and purples, when you print something using the commercial printers, there are extraordinary printers. We're not discussing those. We're not discussing where you're putting in various pigments, which are essentially for poster art. We're talking about regular printers. These come out pretty horrid if you have an eye for color, like at least I do as an artist, and I'm sure most of my fellow artists have. They would look at it and will be like, that didn't come out right, right? Um, there have been several other influential ideas, right? Um, Scientific understanding has been way ahead of the color theory. Um, but you had people who tried to do certain things, like Ogden Rood in 1879 is an American physicist. He tried to look at colors. Albert Munsell looked at the Book of Color 1915, and Munsell color system is quite interesting. It gives sort of a three-dimensional solid where you're looking at one axis is looking at sort of the white to black sort of thing intensity. The other is looking at hue in a circle, and the third one is looking at the chroma, right? Saturation, so to say. So you have traditional color theory, which has complementary colors. It still continues to be taught in school. Very mediocre art. I mean, um, I'll be honest, I go to a lot of Indian art galleries, and sometimes it's like, okay, is there interesting company? And when I say company, I'm not necessarily talking of the artwork. And I don't pretend, right? You see even some of the still these basic ideas being used. Some people, I've even seen an artwork which literally just put the RYB color model with some background, right? So very unoriginal work. But there are some ideas which have continued in art and which have resulted in interesting things. I still have played with the ideas of what color means. So there are ideas of warm and cool colors, which are related to our psychology and hence relevant, how we perceive colors. Some of them are actually very ubiquitous across cultures, and it's worth discussing them. When we think of cool temperature, you think of blue, right? When you think of hot temperature, you think of red. But then there's Doppler effect. Psychological association and real color, hot, cool can be different, right? Okay, hottest radiating bodies can emit blue color, while less hot can emit red color. But when we are thinking of blue, we think ocean blue, right? Because humans evolved in a very limited temperature range, in a very limited color range. So what for us is hot and cold in real scheme may be very different, right? Okay. So you have to see things from a perspective of human evolution. What makes sense for us and what makes sense uh, in real physical world, which is way, way, way beyond, right? The vast universe, we sit on a tiny speck, irrelevant speck called Earth, right? In an irrelevant solar system, in an irrelevant galaxy, in a universe which might even have multiverses. Who knows? And I hope there is even time reversal possible. I like to get better coffee, right? This is cold. But so, in the whole scheme of things, our perception of what is hot, what is cold, is a psychological perception. It's worth understanding it because when I'm making art, by and large, I'm making it for myself and others who I fortunately or unfortunately share species with. Right, so I'm making for other humans. Often used to be even good-looking women when I was a lot younger, and I used to care. Now, if you're thinking of Doppler effect, right? There are traditional ideas of when something is approaching us, right? So when stars and galaxies are moving towards our viewpoint on Earth, they show a blue shift. When stars and galaxies are moving away, they show red shift. That's the Doppler effect. But psychological association is quite the opposite, right? So you may actually, when something is approaching you, you may want to show it as red. You want to show some ambulance coming towards you. If you make traditional like red lights coming towards you, play even with a perspective, not just colors. Instead of blue, you may actually give a very different effect if you're trying to show motion in a still 2D figure, right? So understanding colors from as they are, physics of it, versus the contrast, which is as we perceive, is important because when you're making movies, when you're making posters, when you're making art, you're making for humans, right? Whether you're making it for yourself, which is 70-80% of my work. Once in a while, I care to show. And end of the day, it's still human perception, right? Achromatic colors is also important, right? Uh, any color that lacks strong chromatic content is said to be unsaturated, right? Or neutral or near neutral. Uh, Near neutrals include browns, tans, pastels, darker colors, right? Um, they can be of any hue lightness. Achromatic colors can be useful also in designing good buildings, good architecture. So while color theory in its limited sense is like saying, I'll teach you rules of politics. You can read them and then shred the papers, right? Even people who have been rule breakers in politics, right? Machiavelli, Chanakya. You like to read them, but if you keep going back to book, you'll be like a idiotic idealist, right? Like a lot of Marxists will go back to just this is what Marx said, or this is what right wing somebody Ayn Rand said, and this is what Keynes said, right? This is what Hayek said. Those people are stupid people if they can't evolve solutions on their own, right? So it's basically like that. Read color theory, understand some other things I'm going to still discuss, but then trash them, right? Learn from experience, be your own guru, learn from the whole wide world, and understand whatever you're learning is still bound by human perception, which is very, very limited. Okay? Extremely limited. We sit on a tiny speck, irrelevant speck in this moving across universe. So don't get too fooled by what you see. Don't even get too fooled by what you think. Forget what others think, right? So but in the limited context, tints and shades matter, right? When you're mixing colored light, um, achromatic mixtures of balanced red, green, blue will always give you white, not gray or black. Understanding these basic concepts are useful. What gives you what, right? So understanding tints, shades is important. Understanding even split primary colors, right? When you're painting, um, and looking at these wheels, which obviously I've not looked at for ages, but you will see these split wheels. What is really important is color harmony, right? Colors which are seen together to produce pleasing effect. So this, from technology point of view, is vastly important, which is essentially the series you're enjoying me for. What colors give? Is there a simple mathematical formulation? There have been several, right? Humans can perceive over 2.8 million different colors, right? That's a astounding number to analyze. And there have been interesting theories, right, on color harmony. If you look at my art, actually, often I actively strive for color disharmony, at least in some of the works, right? It was fake smile series. So there was a whole series about humanity having fake smiles, right? I actively sought for disharmony, things which don't go together, right? So, but understanding what goes together, if you're trying to produce pleasing effects, where you're trying to come up with good art, understanding of those rules is important, understanding of perception is important. And there are still some aspects. So, if you look at historically, George Christoph Lichtenberg, right, produced these things in Göttingen. If you look at a very classic uh, plate of his, which is, I think, right around 1775, you will see it as a great example. I mean, I would say visually very pleasing example of how color harmony, can play. It's a split thing. In fact, slight irritating thing in the middle. There's a split in that plate. Wish it was made on a single plate. But there are several examples of color harmony. In fact, in the current day animation, I often see those um, important lessons being thrown, being flushed down the toilet. So I think there is a huge potential for art, not just in terms of painting, in terms of animation, like what kids are being shown, right? So there is a huge potential of exploring color harmony, even understanding how we process monochromatic things, right? Where you have things only of one hue, but you're playing around with the value and playing around with saturation. Uh, at the risk of taking it a personal detour, one of the greatest one-sided, unrequited love I had. In fact, I gave her an artwork back in 2002 3, was about, I called it a monologue, one sided conversation. It was all monochrome, right? Various shades. I don't think she had that nuance understanding, or probably doesn't still have, to get the deeper meaning, right? For her, it was one layer of thinking. And the way I think, most people who get to know me, they're like, okay, just like your paintings have hundreds of layers worked on. Sometimes I can very strongly come off with one layer, and then there are layers for people who can think to the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth level, right? I'm an extreme overthinker. So, but that monochrome was the most suitable thing to express. a single-sided dialogue with various layers. And the idea was that there will be more than one color when the other person participates, instead of just either being in awe or being the object of affection. So I played with monochrome myself in life as a very systematic theme for a few months and thought of role of color. So color is vital to understanding painting, right? People who are interested should look into what is additive color. They should read up on some important people like Charles Albert Keeley was an amateur scientist, entertainer, and pioneering color expert. You should definitely look up on that. People should look at what is called color analysis, seasonal color analysis, skin tone matching, which is very relevant, not just for this art. It's important for cosmetics. Color field paintings was an important thing emerging in which emerged in New York City. I've seen some of its actually very interesting resurgence, and actually, when I first moved to Austin, Texas, I played around with some interesting aspects of it myself. But it was a theme in 1940s and 50s, which was inspired by European modernism and abstract expressionism, right? So one should look at color field. One should also look at color management, right? Where one looks at how color representations of various devices play along. And when I look at products, I mean, look, there are some amazing products. I'm not going to go into design too much, but there are objects of beauty, and then there is crap, absolute crap. I find some of the commercial products to be complete craps, and some commercial products to be better than high art. And good design, like Apple, not trying to promote their products. In fact, I've been actively trying not to use them for some other reason. Would one day want to make something better than that. But there, everything has a utilitarian perspective. There's nothing overdoing something. And we can go on what makes for good design, but even the color management in some of those products, right? Bayer and all, or Apple, companies which are good at design, they have done amazing job even at color management. I can go on the design for several hours. I'm not going to go into it. But those who are interested in movie making, fine arts, right? Any commercial enterprise should understand color mixing. Color psychology is something people should read it well, as much depth, and then trash it. Because end of the day, it is a bit sensitive to the social context. You have to understand people, not necessarily through books, through experience, right? To know. Look up color wheels, right? They are abstract illustrative organization of color hues, useful for picking things in digital art, right? Um, so these are, look up what are complementary colors, will be very useful for commercial art, right? Uh, if you're into animations, HSV, HSL, alternative representations of RGB color will be useful, especially for computer graphics. So, and Arthur Schopenhauer, right, published on vision and colors. It's ancient. Our understanding has changed drastically, but I would still, you know, say that read it. And when you're thinking of color, and you're thinking of art, and art not just as something that hangs on a canvas, uh, do understand what gives sheen, right? Glossiness to the color. Glossy and flat are two extreme levels of glossiness of finish, but that's very important, right? Understand what is subtractive color, right? What is subtractive color mixing? So basically, it predicts how the color would look once it passes through successive layer of partially absorbing media. If it's fully absorbed, obviously nothing's going to go through, right? So when you wear even shades, like I'm wearing glasses, you put shades which are blue tint. What will be the subtractive color mixing? Understanding that is useful, and do look at what is tint, what are shades, right? Tint is mixture of colors with white, right, with increasing lightness. Shade is with mixture of black. So tint and shade are just the two ends of the same spectrum in some ways, right? And tone is produced with mixing gray. So when you're looking at color theory, all this thing plays a role. And as I said in the beginning of all this conversation, when you're training things from a perspective of AI, a lot of this older understanding goes off the window. When you're thinking from printing, some of it is very relevant. Thinking commercial art is still very relevant. So I think that's my longish take on color theory. I hope it helps, probably more than what you'll find in textbooks. Um, uh, that's all I have to say because I think we'll be soon running out of time.
Yeah, right, sir. It will definitely help. And thank you for your very insightful answer. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.